They tell you they're working for your freedom. They speak of growth, of progress, of opportunity. The great promises of prosperity that fill every political speech and government report. But history whispers a different story. Beneath the language of stability and economic reform, there lies a much older pattern, one that stretches back through empires, kingdoms, and republics alike, a pattern of manipulation where the language of freedom conceals a quiet machinery of control, and through that machinery, governments have learned the oldest financial magic trick of all, how to make citizens feel wealthy while keeping them dependent. This is not a new story. It is a recycled illusion, refined through centuries of empire and economics, always wrapped in new packaging, sold with new slogans, but driven by the same objective, to transfer wealth upward and power with it. Let's begin where it all started, with the simplest and most devastating trick in history. When governments spend more than they can raise through honest taxation, they face a choice: tell the truth and risk revolt, or quietly debase the currency and let the public bear the cost without realizing it. Inflation is not an invention of modern economics. It is an ancient weapon dressed in modern clothes. In the 3rd century AD, as the Roman Empire stretched itself thin with wars and debts, emperors faced a familiar problem: too many soldiers, too little silver. Their solution was as subtle as it was destructive. They began reducing the silver content of the denarius, the backbone of Rome's money supply. A coin that once shimmered with near-pure silver became mostly copper, just coated with a thin, deceptive glaze of silver on top. The face of the emperor still smiled back at the people, but its value had rotted from within. Rome pretended nothing had changed, but everything had. As the coins lost value, merchants demanded more of them for the same goods. Inflation soared, wages stagnated, savings turned to dust. The empire's citizens became poorer without understanding why. The government had invented a silent tax, one that didn't require a vote, a law, or an announcement. It simply happened. And though centuries have passed, the trick remains the same. Only now, instead of imperial mints, we have central banks. By the Middle Ages, governments had refined the art of economic pressure. When monarchs in England, France, or Spain ran out of gold to fund wars or royal extravagance, they turned not to the people's consent, but to their compliance. Wealthy merchants, guilds, and nobles were invited to lend money to the crown. Refusal wasn't an option. Those who resisted faced fines, property seizures, or imprisonment. The language was always patriotic: support the realm, defend the faith, aid the king. But behind that language lay coercion disguised as duty. And when repayment came, it arrived in debased currency, or not at all. The crown thrived. The merchants lost. The people saw loyalty. The monarchs saw liquidity. It was a financial sleight of hand that lasted for centuries, until the game evolved into something even grander: a systemic partnership between the state and private capital. The birth of modern finance: debt as power. In 1694, Britain faced a new crisis: war with France and an empty treasury. Out of desperation came innovation, and one of the most consequential institutions in history, the Bank of England. To most, it seemed a patriotic triumph, a way to fund national defense. But in reality, it marked the beginning of a new financial order. Wealthy investors lent their money to the government by purchasing bonds. In return, they received guaranteed interest payments, funded by taxes. It sounded fair, until you realized who paid those taxes. Ordinary citizens, through levies on essentials like salt, beer, and cloth. The rich lent money to the state and earned interest. The poor paid taxes to fund that interest. It was a permanent wealth transfer mechanism, cleverly disguised as national finance. And that mechanism survives to this day. The safest investment in the world remains lending money to governments, and those returns, century after century, are still guaranteed by the labor and consumption of ordinary people. Fast forward to the present, and the tricks have multiplied. Governments now run on deficit spending, borrowing money they do not have for promises they rarely keep. They issue bonds borrowed by investors, banks, and even foreign nations. They call it stimulus, recovery, infrastructure. But look closely at where the money flows. Defense contractors, corporate subsidies, bailouts for industries too big to fail. And when the time comes to pay, the wealthy collect interest, while the public is told that taxes must rise, benefits must fall, and inflation must run its course. The story is always the same. The debt is public, but the profit is private. The burden is shared, but the benefits are not. And perhaps the most audacious performance of this trick came in 2008, during the global financial crisis. Banks had gambled recklessly, packaging toxic mortgages into complex securities. When the system collapsed, it wasn't the gamblers who paid, it was the public. Governments rushed to save the system. They bailed out the very institutions that had caused the collapse, using taxpayer money. The result? Banks grew larger, more powerful, and more concentrated than before. The people who caused the fire were handed the water hose and a bonus. This was the modern version of the oldest financial playbook. Privatize the gains, socialize the losses, and then tell the people it was necessary for their own good. Governments love to talk about retirement security, about social safety nets that ensure no one is left behind. But behind that comforting message lies another sleight of hand. For decades, citizens have paid into pension systems, trusting that the money would be waiting when they retired. But in truth, those funds are often not saved at all. Governments spend them immediately and replace them with IOUs, relying on future taxpayers to fill the gap. It is a generational Ponzi scheme wrapped in legal language. It works as long as the population grows and the young keep paying in. But when demographics shift, when populations age and fewer workers support more retirees, the illusion breaks. Then come the reforms. Reduced benefits, later retirement ages, and inflation that quietly erodes what's left. What was promised as stability becomes scarcity, and yet it continues, because the system depends not on solvency, but on belief. Every era refines the vocabulary of its illusions. Inflation becomes growth. Forced loans become patriotic contributions. Debt becomes investment. Bailouts become stability. And pension cuts become reform. The words change. The purpose doesn't. This linguistic camouflage turns manipulation into policy and theft into governance. Because when you control the language, you control perception. And when you control perception, you can drain wealth in broad daylight and be thanked for it. After 2008, another term entered the public consciousness: quantitative easing. Few understood it. Fewer still questioned it. Central banks created trillions of dollars out of thin air to buy government bonds and mortgage securities, claiming it would stabilize markets, and it did. But not for everyone. Stocks, real estate, and asset prices surged. But who owned those assets? Not the average household. The wealthy, who held the bulk of stocks and property, watched their wealth multiply. Meanwhile, ordinary people faced higher costs of living, stagnant wages, and rising inequality. Quantitative easing wasn't a bailout for the people. It was a lifeline for the financial system, preserving the same structure that caused the crisis. The trick was simple: print money to inflate assets, and let the illusion of prosperity hide the growing divide. Governments rarely raise taxes openly anymore. It's too unpopular. Instead, they've perfected stealth taxation, a series of hidden mechanisms that drain your purchasing power without ever sending you a bill. Sales taxes, fuel duties, value-added taxes all eat away at your earnings invisibly, but the greatest hidden tax of all remains inflation. When prices rise faster than wages, your money loses value even as the numbers on your paycheck grow. It feels like progress. It isn't. Governments benefit because inflation shrinks the real value of their debts. Citizens suffer because their savings and wages buy less each year. Inflation, we are told, is natural, but it is not nature. It is policy. It is the system itself, working as designed. The illusion of protection is another trick. Regulations are presented as shields for the public, but time and again, those shields are forged by the industries they are meant to restrain. In the 19th century, railroads wrote the rules. In the 20th, oil and steel. Today it's tech and finance. This is regulatory capture. When the referee secretly works for the player, governments claim oversight, but the real oversight belongs to those who fund campaigns and shape laws. Even complexity itself becomes a form of control. Thousands of pages of tax codes, financial instruments so tangled even experts can't untie them, budgets buried under jargon and acronyms. Confusion becomes camouflage. When people cannot follow the flow of money, they cannot resist the manipulation. In ancient Rome, debased coins showed the trick. Today, the trick hides in spreadsheets and bond markets, invisible, yet far more powerful. Nothing justifies government spending like war. In World War I and II, citizens were told it was their patriotic duty to buy war bonds. And they did, believing they were saving their nation. But behind that patriotism was a lucrative, risk-free investment for the wealthy, guaranteed by future taxes. In modern times, the pattern remains. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were financed through trillions in debt, a financial feast for defense contractors, banks, and bondholders. The public bore the burden, and long after the soldiers returned home, the debts, and the interest on those debts, continue to grow. Wars end, but the bills never do. Every financial illusion depends on one thing: public ignorance. Because once people understand the game, they can resist it. They can demand transparency, accountability, and reform. But as long as the public sees inflation as natural, taxes as inevitable, and bailouts as mercy, the cycle continues. Governments don't fear debt. They fear education, because a financially literate population is hard to control. And history shows, every empire that kept its citizens in the dark kept its power a little longer. So what should you take from this story? First, question the narrative. When governments announce stimulus, ask who profits first. When inflation rises, remember, it is not bad luck, it is design. When new regulations appear, ask who wrote them and who benefits. Second, build awareness. Financial education is resistance. Economic history is a weapon. To understand money is to see through the illusion. And third, never assume the system exists to serve you. Systems serve themselves. Empires fall. Currencies change. But the tricks endure. Because history doesn't repeat, it recycles. And unless you learn to recognize the patterns, they will always find new names, new faces, and new ways to keep you broke. If this gave you a new perspective, remember, knowledge is leverage, and history has the answers. Subscribe to the Money Archive, where we uncover the patterns of power that shape your wallet, your world, and your future.